have we just started a new forever war that has no limitation, no genuine logic to it, that's now going to extend on ad infinitum?
On Europe, the headline could be civilizational erasure. They basically seem to see Europe as in a massive state of civilizational decline.
From the Vox Media Podcast Network, this is The Long Game. I'm Jake Sullivan.
And I'm John Feiner.
So, John, what's on the agenda for today?
Well, as we foreshadowed a bit last week, we're going to dig into this fast-moving, evolving Venezuela boat story, including the ongoing pressure and investigation about what's sometimes called the double tap, the second strike that took place on a boat in early September. At someone's order, on some legal theory, we'll talk more about that. We're also going to dig into President Trump's national security strategy, which after a lot of anticipation was finally released last week. We have some experience developing a national security strategy, so now we'll try analyzing one.
And then for the third segment, our producers decided we didn't have enough pressure in our lives, so they're springing something new on us. They're going to give us a series of questions that we haven't seen before and ask us to pose them to one another, kind of a lightning round thing. So, we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I'm not terribly optimistic, but looking forward to giving it a try.
But before we get into all that, we have to take a minute to talk about this announcement this week by the Trump administration that they're going to sell this advanced chip, the H-200, to China. But before we even get into that, we have to talk about the most important thing in international affairs.
Biggest breaking news of the last
year,
week or so. Yeah.
Or at least of the week, which is the World Cup draw that took place at the Kennedy Center last week. How are you feeling about where things stand with the World Cup?
Very excited about the fact that the World Cup's coming to North America. So this is going to be a lot of fun. I saw the U.S. draw, which seems, pretty good at this point. Be paying close attention to that. I think in some ways, it's always cool to think about who might be the underdogs that capture a lot of attention in these tournaments. The one I'll be looking at is Haiti, which is a country that has had...
I knew you'd be looking at Haiti.
Country I spent a lot of time on in the government and that has had all manner of challenges and difficulties for the population there. And you can imagine both people in Haiti and around the world maybe getting excited if they catch a tiny bit of momentum, which will be challenging.
Don't sleep on Curacao and Cape Verde as two other really fun underdogs. And then, of course, the underdog that is closest to my heart would be the Republic of Ireland, who hasn't yet qualified, but they're in a playoff that's coming up in the spring to determine whether they get to come to the U.S. next summer. And I will tell all our viewers and listeners, Google Troy Parrott, Hungary, to watch one of the most remarkable sporting moments, I think, of the modern era. This guy scoring a goal at the death to keep Ireland alive.
Kelleher. Scales is up after it. Scales wins the header. There's a chance. Yeah! Oh, there's the goal. There's the goal.
So I'm keeping my fingers crossed they make it in. And of course, there's the U.S. Our first game is against Paraguay. One fun fact I learned about Paraguay is that it's a landlocked country with a navy, which is kind of interesting. So it got me to thinking, first, I think we should record one of these podcasts from the parking lot of a game.
Mainly because it might allow us to actually go to a game.
Yeah, exactly. We'll come up with some journalistic reason why we have to be there. But secondly, over the course of the World Cup, we can have segments that actually get into some of the teams, some of the countries, some of the really interesting dynamics. Like, for example, France playing Senegal in an opening match where you have colonial power against former colony with actually a rich soccer history between them. So
there's actually
really
an awesome book about the sort of geopolitics of soccer by Frank Foer, How Soccer Explains the World, or something like that.
Yeah, he should write a sequel to that book at this point, because I think it's about 20 years old, but fantastic read.
Do you have a pick?
I really don't yet. I guess I'm going to just kind of stick with the U.S. going as far as they can possibly go. I'm saying at least quarterfinals. I can't really look beyond that. As long as the U.S. is in the tournament, I just got to focus on them and Ireland.
Also very much hoping for a good result from the U.S. My sentimental pick might be England, who have been kind of sniffing around the edges of World Cup success for quite some time. Only won one World Cup back in 1966. Definitely one of the best teams in the world, so I'll be watching them.
A little bit of a tough draw.
Tough draw.
You got to play Croatia, who's put them out before. So let's talk about chips for a minute before we get into our main segments. Now, John, last week you predicted this Trump move. You said there was a good chance that that President Trump might go ahead and approve this advanced chip, the H200, really quite remarkable. I think a massive strategic own goal. I think the technical term is this is crazy. But how do you read this, and can you explain for folks what the implications of it are?
Yeah, so there are a few things that are happening here. There was a lot of rumor, I think a lot of projection in the run-up to President Trump's meeting with President Xi back in October, which we talked about earlier in a podcast, that President Trump might remove some of the U.S. export controls on advanced chips to China. He ultimately decided not to do that, which I think those of us who think that was a bad idea, that would have been a bad idea, breathed a sigh of relief. But this issue never completely went away. And then over the course of the last week, the administration looked again at a different chip, actually a more advanced chip, a chip called the H200, which is by technical counts 6 times as capable as the most advanced chip that we currently sell to China, which is the H20.
Miles more capable than any indigenous Chinese chip.
Yes. And in fact, again, by China's own projections, they won't produce a chip as advanced as the H200 until late 2027. So this is going to give them a massive head start on their own indigenous production. And, negates or at least erodes one of the big strategic advantages the United States has in the AI race, which is just raw horsepower compute. China has other advantages. It doesn't have the same, let's just say, regulatory environment we have in the United States in terms of producing infrastructure. It doesn't have the same challenges with regard to power generation. But a big advantage the United States has is we produce the best, design the best chips, and we can control, if we choose to, where those chips end up, including to China. And we seem to have decided to take that advantage off the table.
Well, you don't even have to take it from John Feiner. The CEO of DeepSeek, one of these Chinese companies that's producing their highest-end AI models, has said the biggest limitation on China making progress in its competition with the U.S. on AI is access to advanced compute. And President Trump has just decided to make life a lot easier for China by giving them this compute. Now, the argument that the Trump administration is putting forward, which is basically the argument that the CEO of Nvidia, Jensen Huang, is putting forward, has sort of 3 or 4 elements to it. The first is we need the revenue from China to be able to fund R&D in the United States, because if we don't sell these chips to China, our company's going to lose a lot of money. Jensen and NVIDIA started making this argument back in 2022 when we in the Biden administration first put these chip controls on. Since then, I think NVIDIA's done pretty well, notwithstanding the controls. Why? There's enormous demand outside of China for this. And NVIDIA, in fact, spent a lot of its money last year on stock buybacks, not on plowing money into research, because they got to put the money somewhere. They're making so much of it. The second argument is, this isn't that powerful a chip. But as you just said, it's 6 times more powerful than any chip we sell them, and 2 years ahead, nearly 2 years ahead of where China will be in terms of its own chip production. And 2 years matters a lot at the speed with which this race is taking off. The third argument is, if they buy the H200, somehow they're going to lose interest in developing their own domestic ecosystem. They'll get addicted to U.S. technology. Well, long before we put any chip controls in place in 22 or 23 or 24, President Xi Jinping had sent a directive saying the paramount priority is indigenize our semiconductor manufacturing ecosystem. We cannot be reliant on the West for it. So they're going to go run pell-mell, and all we've done is now just given them chips to fill the gap between now and when they have indigenized their stack and taken away the advantage or reduced the advantage severely from where we were before. So the bottom line is we had a big lead. We've just given it a lot of it away. And essentially what Trump is saying is, at least I'm getting a 25% kickback to the U.S. government, which may or may not even be legal. But from China's perspective, small price to pay for essentially a priceless gain in the AI race.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the biggest mystery of this for an art of the deal administration is why we didn't try to extract. If we were going to do this, which I think it would be a very high price for me to believe that this was a good idea. Why did we not try to extract more or really anything from China in return, given that we are locked in this kind of protracted negotiation on our economic relationship with them? And the idea seems to be that he believed that this was important to do, maybe for the economic reasons that you described, which are rebuttable, but also because he believes it's necessary to have this good relationship with China that he seems to want. I'm not sure it's much more complicated than that. I just wish we had gotten something for what is a major, major strategic move. And just to show how kind of whiplash-inducing this all is, just yesterday, the same day as the announcement that the United States was going to stop controlling this chip, the Justice Department, President Trump's own Justice Department, announced the arrest of a bunch of people, the indictment and arrest of a bunch of people for selling H200 chips, the same chips that is no longer controlled, to China. So this is a major shift in policy. Anything else on kind of where you think this goes from here?
Well, I think we should devote a segment to this in our next pod because there are larger implications for the U.S.-China relationship. This is an early indicator of President Trump's mindset as he heads into a consequential year in 2026 with a big summit in Beijing and then a big summit in Washington. And the fact that he's willing to give this away, I think, also raises questions about what he's willing to give away on Taiwan, too. So we should talk chips and China, Trump and Xi as we head into next week. For now, I think really putting a fine point on the fact that this is a massive decision, a decision I think you and I both think is totally wrongheaded. The arguments against it are so much more powerful than the arguments for it. But let's see how things unfold. Let's see how Republicans on the Hill react because they've been very opposed to this kind of move from President Trump. Spoiler alert, they're probably not going to do anything. And let's come back to this next week. But with that, why don't we turn it over to Venezuela and I'll kick it to you to tee it up.
All right. So we've talked a bit about the story of these boat strikes in international waters off of Venezuela, both the Caribbean and then in the Pacific on the other side. And this story just continues to evolve in complicated ways. On the one hand, it feels like this is all escalating. We've now had, I think it's over 20 strikes and over 80 people killed in those strikes. And, of course, the revelation more recently of this double tap strike, which has gotten attention because it involved the killing, deliberate killing, it seems like, of two survivors who were on one of the ships. And the condition of that ship is kind of contested space, and we can dig into that a little bit. But the ship had at least been struck once. It doesn't seem like it was able to move under its own power. There were two survivors on it, and the military chose to strike it again. That has gotten a lot of scrutiny in Congress. Congress, in closed session, has seen the video of that strike. Members have come out and talked about it. We, the public, have not seen that video. That's another a shoe that could drop sometime soon. But it's raised all these questions about the wisdom of that strike, about the legality of that strike, about the morality of that strike. And it has gotten Congress exercised in a way that sort of few things in the Trump era have. On the other hand, there's still more that could come on the escalation side, because as you've emphasized throughout our conversations on this, all of this feels like the precursor to potential direct U.S. military action in and on Venezuela with the goal of, I don't know, probably something along the lines of regime change to try to topple the Maduro government, which the Trump administration has signaled it may decide to do. And President Trump himself has said, while kind of distancing himself from some of the strikes we're talking about, that we may see direct strikes on Venezuelan territory and maybe the territory of other countries. And we haven't seen that yet. So I think that's basically the lay of the land. The administration has not, in a very effective way, come out and explained and defended what it's done. It's chosen to do that kind of behind closed doors with military speakers in Congress. Tom Cotton went on Meet the Press, I think, and gave basically the best defense that I've seen of...
Which is saying something.
Which is saying something, that it had to be him in particular. And
it wasn't that good a defense.
They were not floating in the ocean on a wooden plank or in life jackets. They were on the capsized vessel. They were not incapacitated in any way. It was entirely appropriate to strike the boat again to make sure that cargo was destroyed. It is in no way violation of the law of war.
So that seems to be the position that they're going to cling to. I think absent showing the public the video, that's going to be a pretty hard line to hold. And once the public sees the video, maybe even worse.
So President Trump said, as he's wont to do, yeah, go ahead, release the video. Secretary Hegseth has been a lot less clear about whether he intends to do so or not. Congress took an unusual step on a bipartisan basis In the National Defense Authorization Act, they put in a provision that basically fenced money for Pentagon travel until the video is shown more broadly.
I think, and the legal order has to be provided
as well as providing the legal order. Okay, my view on this is let's get the video out, let people judge for themselves. What it looks like is kind of Occam's razor, the simplest thing. They hit the boat, a couple guys survived, the boat was wrecked, and it's very clear in the Pentagon's Law of War manual that orders to fire upon the shipwrecked would be, quote, clearly illegal. So can't get more clear than that. Senator Cotton's trying to wriggle out of that by saying it's not wrecked somehow, which I think is probably a stretch based on other comments from folks who have seen the video. But I think the question is why this matters in the bigger picture. And let's start with the fact that this was the first strike they took in this campaign of boat strikes. And it raises a lot of pretty basic questions. First, they weren't hitting a boat carrying fentanyl, which is what's really killing Americans. They hit a boat carrying cocaine. Second, they actually had no idea who was on the boat. In fact, in the testimony, the closed-door testimony up on the Hill, it emerged that ordinarily you'd have just a very small number of passengers on a boat that was ferrying drugs, like 3 or 4. In this case, there were 11. And that suggests at least some of the folks on the boat probably had nothing to do with the carrying of drugs. But we don't know. We have no idea who we're even hitting or we're being trafficked. I mean, you really don't know. And then third, and this is pretty critical, the boat wasn't actually coming to the United States of America. It was going to Suriname. Why is that relevant? Well, first, Suriname is not America. And earlier, the Trump administration had come out and said this boat was coming to the United States, bringing drugs to the United States. Second, Suriname is a major transport country for drugs to Europe, not to the United States. So odds are this was cocaine headed for Europe that we're blasting out of the water. And it really raises the question, have we just started a new forever war that has no limitation, no genuine logic to it, that's now going to extend on ad infinitum, even leaving aside the regime change question, which we'll come to? What is the limiting principle here? Are we going to start hitting boats with fentanyl precursors off the coast of China? Are we going to start hitting heroin in Afghanistan? Are we going to start actually hitting fentanyl in Mexico? And by the way, you and I have talked about the fact that there are plans on the shelf to do just that. So is this going to be the new game plan? Just go bomb things in various places all over the world. When you have a nexus as loose as this one, cocaine bound for Suriname, to be taking strikes with a crew you have no idea who they are or what they're doing, you've kind of set yourself up to do a lot in a lot of places basically forever.
Yeah, I mean, they have basically explicitly said that they are starting a new forever war because they have not articulated when this would ever end. Their goal is to deter, they say, the trafficking of drugs to the United States. So as long as there are drugs moving in the direction they believe of the United States, that would suggest they're just going to keep doing this. And they have explicitly also analogized this to the counterterrorism efforts of the Forever War. They designated the cartels as terrorist organizations, and they are applying the same military tactics that we used over 20 years to target terrorist organizations to these cartels. And the Europe point is a really interesting one because in the counterterrorism context, we sometimes work with European partners on a theory of what we call collective self-defense. If we think that there are terrorists who are going to attack our allies and they want us to help defend them from these attacks, it almost gives us license to take out those terrorists even if they are not directly attacking the United States, this international legal theory of collective self-defense. In this context, I don't think there are any European countries who are asking the United States to take out cartel boats just because those boats might be trafficking drugs in the direction of Europe.
No, in fact, the United Kingdom has suspended intelligence sharing with the U.S. in this region because it's so concerned about what we're doing. So quite the opposite. The Europeans are saying, what the hell are you guys up to?
Don't do this on our behalf. Thanks.
Okay, so then there's the Maduro piece of it, which you mentioned. So part of this huge movement of American hardware, more than 10% of our naval assets in the world now in the Caribbean, more than 15,000 forces off the coast of Venezuela. that has the feeling of something coming more than just hitting some boats. It has the feeling of hitting Venezuela. But of course, that's been true now for 2-3 months. You know, you have younger brothers. I have younger brothers. When we were growing up, I don't know if you guys ever played the game where you'd kind of put your hand right real close to their face and be like, I'm not touching you. I'm not touching you. I'm not touching you. That's effectively what we've been doing now for 2 months off the coast of Venezuela. I think, A, trying to provoke a response from them that would justify action, but B, trying to rattle their cages to get Maduro to step aside. And there have been these reports that Trump and Maduro have spoken more than once, that the demand is he go. And look, I don't think we can rule anything out, but what does seem unlikely at this point is that the entire Chavista regime in Caracas is going to walk out the door and usher in a new democratic era in Venezuela, small d democratic era. This seems unlikely. So, and Maduro seems to be saying, I'm not prepared to completely give up power. There are formulas where maybe he personally steps aside. We'll have to see how that all plays. But the idea that his whole regime is going to just walk away doesn't seem all that likely. So should we expect American military action in Venezuela in the coming weeks? Or is this just in the completely who knows category?
Yeah, make me make the prediction. I got it.
Yeah, no. Exactly.
Look, on the one hand, on the little brother analogy, very rare that you put your hand close to your little brother's face and don't actually end up touching it,
yeah, exactly.
or he doesn't end up trying to hit you, at least in my family's experience. So that's one, I think, important point. Second, related, it's very unusual that the United States deploys a massive amount of military force like this and doesn't end up using it in some significant way. Highly unusual, I would say, to do that. And here it seems like they have every intention of at least doing some sorts of airstrikes in Venezuela, whether that evolves or slips into full-on regime change, I think remains to be seen. But right now, it does feel a little bit like Maduro is calling President Trump's bluff. On the theory that, and we'll talk about President Trump's national security strategy next, that this is a president who historically has not favored military intervention in countries. And I think on the theory that President Trump's main priority when it comes to the hemisphere, in addition to the trafficking of drugs, is migration. And I think there are going to be voices inside the Trump administration who say, if you launch some massive military campaign on Venezuela, there are millions more people inside Venezuela now who are going to get on the road and move in the direction of the United States, and you don't want that. So I think even some of the hardline voices on these issues inside the administration will have a little bit of trepidation.
And maybe
about
that's part
change.
of why. Maybe that's part of why there has been this huge buildup this month of anticipation they haven't acted yet. Is they're genuinely debating.
Yeah.
Part of it is let's see if we can squeeze Maduro out, but part of it may be they're just not quite sure. To your point, though, the laws of physics tend to lean towards things happening as opposed to not happening. But I'm very much in the who knows category because the whole thing is pretty strange. It's pretty inconsistent with the president's kind of theory of not having wars as opposed to just going and looking for and starting one. But there's a lot setting up for this. And, I'll just make one more observation generally, which is how do we know that the drugs piece of this isn't really all that credible a basis for why President Trump is taking these strikes? Because if he were really serious about dealing with the drug problem, would he actually be pardoning massive drug traffickers? Two in particular stand out to me. One, the former Honduran president who trafficked, I think, more than 400 tons of cocaine to the United States and actually said he wanted to shove it up the noses of gringos. Got a long sentence. President Trump pardoned him. Second guy he pardoned was the guy who ran this Silk Road site, which was the biggest dark web site for drug trafficking at the time in the world. Trump pardons that guy. So if you're serious about drugs, why are you doing that? And then if you're serious about dealing with the drug problem in the United States, why is RFK slashing the budget for substance use disorder, mental health, and other things related to drug and alcohol addiction, it makes no sense. I mean, they are going out of their way to undermine the domestic side of the ledger here. And a lot of these were programs that were starting to have a really good effect. So, for example, the last year of the Biden administration, there was a dramatic reduction in fentanyl-related deaths. And President Trump has done a U-turn on a lot of the domestic investments while starting this pretty performative campaign against boats, many of which are A, not carrying fentanyl, and B, bound for Europe.
Yeah, look, there's a lot that doesn't feel like it's on the level here, including that if you were serious, as you mentioned, about going after drug cartels and stopping the flow to the United States, one thing you might want to do is, rather than blow these boats out of the water, roll up the guys who are on them and ask who hired them and try to kind of work your way up the chain of command in these organizations. They are forfeiting the opportunity to do that by just simply killing these people. They think maybe deterrence will be produced by that, but not a lot of evidence the boats are stopping, at least so far. And then just one other, I think, thing to flag about why traditionally we do not treat people who are, lost at sea in this way. And this is a story from my time in government. In 2016, I think it was January of 2016, some United States sailors went off course, had some mechanical failures in the Gulf, and ended up in Iranian territorial waters.
Oh, yeah. I was not in government at the time, but when I saw that happen, I thought, Feiner and those guys must be having a lot of fun right now.
What a nightmare.
Getting the call.
And by the way, it was 1 week before we were supposed to implement the Iran nuclear deal.
Right.
So 1 week before the day at which the deal was supposed to take effect, and Iran was supposed to dismantle all its facilities, a bunch of American sailors get rolled up by the Iranian Navy. And yes,
basically because the boat had engine trouble and floated into
on a little island off the coast that was Iranian territory. And these guys got arrested and videoed and the whole thing. And the United States had the credible ability in that circumstance. And yeah, I did get the call from a guy you'll know, a national intelligence officer for Iran, who we both worked with. Had to walk upstairs to John Kerry, who was the Secretary of State, who was doing an event on God knows what, not this topic, and say, you got to call the Iranians and tell them immediately release these American sailors. And in that circumstance, they were released within 24 hours and the deal got implemented. In a situation in which the United States is demonstrating just total disregard for the lives of people who are lost at sea, we have to call into question whether this is going to endanger our own people.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This story isn't going anywhere. In fact, between the time we're taping today, early in the week, and when this pod drops, bombs could be dropping too, for all we know. Or it could be another month or 2 months, or they may cut some deal. So we have to be prepared for any eventuality. Keep watching this as we go forward. Should we turn to the national security
look,
strategy?
This is obviously pretty closely tied in some ways to some of the big themes in the national security strategy.
Well, it absolutely is.
Okay, so maybe we should just start by talking a little bit about what a national security strategy is, how it's produced, why it matters, why maybe it doesn't matter as much as kind of the ferocious reaction of pundits and people like us would suggest. So we've both been involved in producing these and very involved in producing Joe Biden's national security strategy, which came out, I think, in 2022, although we did a kind of an interim version initially. To me, there are a few purposes of these documents. One is they are very helpful internally to an administration in kind of organizing your thinking and setting a plan for the years ahead. So almost for your own purposes as an administration, they have a value. Second,
can I just ask you to pause there? Because there's been some commentary from folks saying, it doesn't really matter. It's a document. It's out there. But Trump, the people around him, they're not going to pay any attention to it. I would say typically your point that actually this does become a touchstone document that does have some impact on the way departments and agencies end up operating, that has definitely been my experience. And I think it has an internal effect that is real, not always totally tangible, but definitely carries through the term. And I think that will be true of this one.
Well, and I think particularly, so we were political appointees, 2 different administrations. Government is made up of a relatively small number of political appointees and then a large number of civil servants, foreign service officers, military, intel people who are the career government. And I think for their purposes in particular, they want to know what the priorities and direction of the administration is. The political appointees tend to have a better sense of that because they come out of the orbit of the person who becomes president. But for the career professional government, this document, I think, becomes quite an important set of guidance for them. So I agree with you, probably more on the important side, less on the trivial side. How is it produced? I think this is where the analogy to the past probably completely breaks down. I mean, our team spent a ton of time going around to the different departments and agencies, getting their input, settling disputes about what should be prioritized and what shouldn't, and producing a document that, and by the way, this is something I think the Trump national security strategy is fair about. It basically says previous national security strategies tend to be a laundry list, not sufficiently prioritized. Christmas tree, whatever it is. We're going to be sort of ruthlessly focused on priorities. Now, whether they did that or not, I think that is the right impulse and the right mindset. It says in there at some point, if everything is a priority, then nothing is a priority, which is a sort of a truism. I think the other purpose of these documents is to signal to your friends around the world and also to your adversaries around the world, whatever it is you choose to signal in that document. Because one community in which this is widely and closely read is diplomats and politicians in other countries. As I was going around the world over the last year, it would come up over and over again what is going to be in the Trump national security strategy and, almost as importantly, in the national defense strategy, which is a companion document generally that the Trump administration has not yet published, but people anticipate is going to be coming soon. So I think for foreign counterparts on the friend side, on the adversary side, they'll be looking at this very closely.
Well, here's what I'll start by saying. This national security strategy was immediately praised by Russia when it came out. The senior Russian officials said that it aligned closely with their view. I think that kind of tells you a lot of what you need to know. Overall, the way I would describe this national security strategy is that they've taken the subtext of MAGA foreign policy and made it text. They've essentially kind of replaced a focus on geopolitics with a focus on right-wing identity politics. And they've set aside great power competition vis-a-vis Russia and China in favor of really an overriding focus on our previous topic, migration and drugs and the Western Hemisphere. So it's quite soft on Russia and China. It talks about strategic stability with Russia and a mutually advantageous economic relationship with China. It is very tough on our European allies, which we'll come to. It is sweeping on the Western Hemisphere, including reviving the Monroe Doctrine, which was a 19th century doctrine about keeping European colonial powers out, and adding a Trump corollary, which essentially says the U.S. can act as it sees fit and impose its will as it sees fit within the hemisphere. And then it's very long on traditional cultural values. So on the whole, I would say it is a radical departure from not just decades of bipartisan national security strategies. It's actually a radical departure from the national security strategy of the first Trump administration, which centered on great power competition, particularly competition with China, but also with Russia. It has set that aside basically entirely in this document. It sees China through an economic lens, and it sees Russia through the lens of a country that we ought to be able to more or less cut a deal with. So the way I would sum it up is kind of harkens back to when I was working for Secretary Clinton. We were in Hanoi for what was called the ASEAN Regional Forum, basically a gathering of Southeast Asian nations and some of the other big players in the region. And the Chinese foreign minister at the time, Yang Jiechi, gave this kind of incredible speech, looking around the table at countries like Singapore and Cambodia and Laos, smaller countries. And he said something along the lines of, the truth is that there are big countries in the world and there are small countries. And that's just a fact. And what he was basically saying was, there should be spheres of influence. The big countries should be cutting deals amongst themselves and kind of dictating to the rest of the world. This national security strategy, to me, reads a lot like that. Basically, spheres of influence. The U.S. will deal with China and Russia. Everyone else will kind of be told what's what. And I think that doesn't serve the United States well, but it is a theory, and it seems to be the theory that this administration is pursuing. So do you want to talk about what the strategy says about our European allies?
Yeah, look, I've kind of divided my thoughts on this into what's good and what's bad in the strategy. At the top of the list to me of what's bad is basically the entire section on Europe. We should come back to, in fairness, maybe a few things that we think in here are good, but we can save that till the end. On Europe, the headline, I would say, if you wanted to put it in two words, could be civilizational erasure. They basically seem to see Europe as in a massive state of civilizational decline. And what do they mean by that? You talked a bit about the import of right-wing identity politics into a national security document. The kind of epicenter of that is the Europe section, where they basically see migration as having eroded or erased what it means to be European. And there are some lines in here that are quite remarkable. They praise, for example, the growing influence of what they call patriotic European parties. They call that a source of great optimism. That is a not very veiled reference, I think, to right-wing populist movements that the United States has historically rejected, that this administration has all but embraced, and probably a harbinger of coming U.S. support for those parties in future European elections.
I mean, just to pause on that, that's more than all but embrace. That's a full-on embrace, right? It's specifically rooting for right-wing parties. As you said, the growing influence of patriotic European parties gives cause for optimism. That's kind of directly intervening in the domestic politics of these countries.
Yeah. They say in this document that if current trends continue, the continent will be unrecognizable in 20 years or less, that it is far from obvious whether certain European countries will have economies and militaries strong enough to remain reliable allies, that they chide European countries for doubling down on this path. And they talk about this desire for Europe to regain its civilizational self-confidence and to abandon other aspects of its current trajectory. They also there's a part of the document that has this strange phrasing where they basically say many European countries are on a path to be majority non-European,
right.
As if you are born somewhere else, end up in Europe, become a citizen of those countries, you are not a European, which is itself a remarkable statement. Also, I think a version of how they view Americans who come to this to this country.
But the kicker on that, John, on that phrase about majority non-European, is it comes in a paragraph that I think may be one of the most remarkable paragraphs in the whole strategy, because what it says is, you see, when these countries signed up to NATO, they were basically white.
Yeah.
Now that they have growing minority populations, maybe they aren't going to be good NATO allies in the future.
And maybe we aren't going to want to defend them either.
Yeah. So it actually explicitly raises the possibility that the NATO alliance will have to change if and when any of these countries become, in their phraseology, quote, majority non-European. Pretty remarkable.
Yeah, especially when paired with a leak that came just after the publication of the National Security Strategy, which I can't validate, but which suggests that the United States is giving NATO countries a timeline by which they have to take much greater operational control over many things that the alliance is doing militarily in the coming 3 or 4 years, which would be a rapid and dramatic change if, in fact, the United States is going to try to impose that on NATO. So yeah, the NATO section also disturbing. Where the rubber really meets the road, I think, on the European section, though, is on the Ukraine war.
Yes, exactly.
Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I'll say a couple things about this. Linking the conversation about far-right parties and Ukraine, because the way I kind of read this section is that these guys in MAGA foreign policy basically believe Europe is one election cycle behind the United States, that the right wing is going to take over. And just as they read their kind of honestly narrow election win in the United States, just in terms of the vote totals, for a sweeping mandate, they're kind of reading it not just as a sweeping mandate in America, but for the world. And their argument on Ukraine is basically overwhelmingly the populations oppose continuing to support Ukraine, but these kind of lefty, soft, coalition governments are insisting on supporting Ukraine anyway. And if the true will of the people were reflected, they would stop supporting Ukraine and they would cut a deal with Russia. That's basically the logic of the national security strategy written out in quite an explicit way. And the thing that I find kind of interesting about it, this is a empirical fact, is I just kind of reject the idea that in fact supporting Ukraine is unpopular in Europe. I think they have a blind spot on this. I think majorities, not just in Europe, but in the United States,
continues to be popular
continue
here.
to very much support Ukraine and to be very concerned about the threat Russia poses. But they do not see that. So they effectively say, governments, get out of the way of your people, the will of the people, cut a deal with Russia, and we'll let Ukraine kind of end up as a, quote, viable state. But more or less, the document really signals a strong, I wouldn't even say thumb on the scale, a fist on the scale in favor of Russia over Ukraine.
Their goal for Russia, they say, is restoring strategic stability. They say almost nothing negative about Russia in this document at all, and they express a desire for what Trump has said quite publicly, a better relationship with Russia, a more stable relationship with Russia. While at the same time, on Europe, the phrase that illustrates what you were just describing is that the Trump administration finds itself at odds with European officials who hold unrealistic expectations for the war, perched in unstable minority governments, many of which trample on basic principles of democracy to suppress opposition, suggesting that it's a few European bureaucrats who support Ukraine. The vast majority of the people do not, and those governments are not long for this world. Which, as you say, I think empirical evidence really does strongly suggest otherwise. And by the way, the best validation of your argument is that democratically elected officials don't tend to be politically suicidal. If their whole populations are turning against the war, I think you would see more movement away from supporting Ukraine from people who rely on elections to survive. And you're not seeing that.
Right. Now, this is not to say that we won't see significant gains by right-wing parties. We have seen that in different parts of Europe and in Germany and France and the UK, strong polling for right-wing parties. I have my doubts about the staying power of that over the midterm, but we'll find out. But on the Ukraine question, I think they are fundamentally misperceiving things. I'll say one other thing about totally throwing your lot in with the far right in Europe, leaving aside all the moral elements of that. The AfD, the far-right party in Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland, Alternative for Germany, is basically an anti-American party, has been historically. So there is something a bit goofy about deciding that's the horse you want to ride in an American national security strategy. But, so be it. Okay, we've said some tough things about this strategy, but, you also had a list of things you thought actually made a little bit more sense or that you see as positive.
Yeah, maybe I'll put a few things out there. By the way, the strategy had some tough things to say about us and our time in the government. I think it's the second sentence says, oh yeah, after 4 years of weakness, extremism, and deadly failures. That is how they sum up the tenure of the Biden administration. So,
that wasn't about the first Trump administration?
What goes around comes around. I think that's probably what we wrote about the first Trump administration. But anyway, all right, what are some of the positive things? So here's a few from my list. Look, I think I said earlier, the fact that it purports to prioritize, I think is good. I think you do have to, in an era of limited resources and a big world, decide and signal what is going to be most important to you. So the fact that they are trying to do that, not in ways at all that I would endorse, I think is the right mindset.
And to be fair, I think goes beyond purports. It still lists a lot of things, but it's definitely a more focused document than previous national security strategies.
Agree. I think their list of U.S. vital interests, which they say guides everything that flows from that, is defensible. Starting with the homeland and maybe an overemphasis for my taste on the Western Hemisphere. But the Western Hemisphere is actually a strategically important region for the United States and maybe has been underinvested in the past. Wouldn't go about it the way they're doing it. Second, they do talk about economic prosperity as a national security concern. I think we very much shared that view and believed in restoring U.S. economic vitality and dynamism at the beginning of our administration, built that into our national security strategy.
Honestly, there are passages on industrial strategy,
sound a lot
on
like us.
Technology, on other things that look very similar to what we had in the Biden national security strategy.
They call supporting allies a vital national interest. Now, everything that flows from that in the lower part of the document, it kind of undermines it. But I do think they are right to say so. Again, doing it in their own particular way. I think not allowing an adversary to dominate the Middle East, that is another vital interest. I think we would very much agree with that. And then their last point about U.S. tech and standards leading the world is one that we would share and included in our national security strategy. I think it's good that they say that they will not change U.S. declaratory policy on Taiwan, but ... Stay tuned.
They may.
Because I think there's a very good chance that
future episode
that doesn't last very long and is only worth the paper it's written on. But if that ends up holding, we talked about this just last week, the debate about whether to change U.S. declaratory policy on Taiwan. They say they won't do it. We'll see. I think they have a predisposition to not intervening militarily. It means, I think, primarily in other countries. I think that is a good impulse generally. Again, stay tuned because we just spent 20 minutes talking about the possibility of their launching a major military intervention in a country in our own hemisphere. But I think that's basically a good thing. And as you said, the whole section about economic security, I think, is reasonably well done. There's sort of an overemphasis, again, to my mind, on trade imbalances, which President Trump is obsessed with and has been since his first term. But the desire to reindustrialize, to identify as core U.S. advantages our leadership of the global financial system. I think these are smart places to identify priorities.
I agree with all of that. Starting with your first point, that I think the document tries to seriously be a strategy. Now, I have made clear my concern about it, but I tip my cap at least at just that abstract level. And then I want to reinforce the point you made about the Western Hemisphere. You said maybe overemphasized. Maybe that's right. But, I will say, honestly, in the Biden administration and frankly in the Obama administration as well, we probably underemphasized it. And it would be fair to say that lifting that up, thinking about a strategic home base of the Americas, that, as President Biden used to like to say, is secure, middle class, and democratic from Canada down to Chile, that should be a vision for a future that is consistent with strategic competition with China, that is consistent with reindustrialization and secure supply chains for the United States of America, and that is consistent with a kind of broader vision of how we reinforce the core elements of our national security across the board. So I don't love the actualization of how they play out the priority of the Western Hem, but lifting it up in the way that they did, I think they deserve some credit in concept for that. We're watching the execution. We just spent a lot of time on the execution. That's a different story. And one other thing that I found kind of striking, real emphasis on commercial deals, on commercial diplomacy, which honestly has this tinge of the friends and family plan.
Another C word.
Yeah,
corruption.
Right, exactly. And it was interesting to see how that was a thread throughout this document and is a thread throughout all of their foreign policy. How adjacent to whatever diplomacy they do, there seems to be some self-dealing associated.
Although I think we would also agree that investment as a foreign policy tool, investing our private sector in strategically important industries in other countries is something we believed was quite important, that much of the world has a deep desire for. And I would give them some credit for lifting that up in this document.
Yeah, agreed.
Can I give one other good thing that I forgot to mention? I think you'll very much agree with, but then we should say maybe if there are a few other things that we think are problematic. India and the U.S.-India relationship is kind of redeemed in this document.
Briefly.
I mean, it's not a long mention, but in terms of priorities, it does say we must continue to improve commercial and other relations with India, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This has been a totally mismanaged relationship from the beginning, more or less, by this administration. I think, you've written about this. Yeah. We've talked about this, the importance of getting this back on track. I think that signal in the national security strategy is a good one. And Pakistan, which they have sort of lifted up at the expense of India to some extent, gets just a brief mention in the context of President Trump's one of the many wars he has purportedly ended, the India-Pakistan brief conflict. That's the only mention, I think, of Pakistan in the document.
So you hinted at other things you have concerns about in the document. Do you want to?
Well, sure. There is no mention at all in this document of the DPRK. Now, look, I'm not one of these people who thinks you should go, Control F looking for things that aren't mentioned and say,
Did you go
gotcha.
Control F?
On this one, I didn't see it when I read through, and I did. And the reason it's important, I think, is one, this is like a major threat. Not one that we have a lot of good options for dealing with, but a major, major threat. A country that has nuclear weapons and is hostile to us. But two, this is a country that when you ignore it, it has a way of deciding it doesn't like to be ignored.
Hey, we're here.
Yeah, reminding you.
By the way, interesting, given Trump won, how much emphasis there was on DPRK. And by the way, could very well come back as a major foreign policy issue for the reason you say, or because President Trump just decides he wants to go see his buddy Kim Jong-un.
Yeah. And then the last thing that's on my list of just strange problems with this document is they have this list in here of U.S. advantages as we kind of go around with and deal with the world. By the way, I think it's a pretty good list. But when you look at it, they seem to be systematically eroding almost every one of them. A nimble political system that can course correct while we have a president kind of musing about the possibility of running for a third term. The world's most advanced innovative technology sector while we, sell our most advanced technology.
Cut basic research.
Sell
Attack
technology to our
universities.
adversaries. Broad network of alliances. We've talked about how shabbily it treats alliances. It says an enviable geography, which is true, our own hemisphere, borders at no risk of military invasion, and then talks about how we need to massively reinvest in our own hemisphere from a perspective of military posture, which seems surprising.
Also, we may be conducting military operations across one of those borders
another
down
country's
in Mexico.
border.
Yeah.
And then it talks about our soft power and cultural influence, which I feel like is massively being eroded.
I had that on my list, this specific call out of soft power. It's just very interesting to be like, soft power is super important. Also, Europe, you're all a bunch of assholes. It's like, okay, yeah, very, very soft, that soft power. So I couldn't agree more. Interestingly, there was no rollout of this national security strategy. For the first one, President Trump actually gave a big speech. We did a whole rollout ourselves in the Biden administration. So they just kind of dropped this thing last week, and we'll see what comes of it. I think we're moving on now to this interesting segment where our producers are going to hand us questions to ask each other that we have not seen before in a kind of lightning round format.
Been in sealed envelopes.
So we're going to see how that goes. I'm a little nervous.
Either it'll be fun or we'll never do it again. All right, Jake. If foreign policy and national security work had a soundtrack, what genre would it be?
Country. If your email inbox had a soundtrack, what genre would it be?
Like the most chaotic heavy metal. I think I have more than 300,000 unread emails going back many years.
God.
Jake, what is your favorite constitutional amendment?
14th. What's one amendment, or although it may not be anymore after the Supreme Court rules on birthright citizenship, what's one amendment or law that should be overturned?
I have a lot of Supreme Court decisions of recent vintage that I would overturn. I'm not sure I have a constitutional amendment that I would overturn at this time. What's the most overvalued quality in a president?
Height.
There you go. All for that.
What's the most undervalued quality in a president?
I would say basic human decency.
Nice.
What's the best trait for a presidential advisor?
Being from Minnesota.
Not sure I fully concur with that one, but what's your answer?
The most annoying trait in a presidential advisor?
I'm going to go with the same answer you just gave. In 3 words or less, your leadership style. I wish I could answer this about you. Just kidding.
Open to debate.
I think that's actually accurate.
In 3 words or less, what's your decision-making style?
Deliberative, inclusive. This is more words. Slower than it should be sometimes.
We'll let you squeeze it in there.
Thank you. What's the one question you ask yourself before saying yes to a job?
Will the person I work for and the people I work with be people I want to see every day? What's the one question you ask yourself before saying no to a job?
Yeah, version of what you just said, I think. Am I going to actually enjoy and believe in the integrity of the people I'll be working with and for? What's your go-to comfort show?
Maggie and I rewatched all of Dawson's Creek while I was National Security Advisor. That's a great show. What's your go-to comfort food?
French fries. Most consecutive hours you've gone without sleeping?
That's a great question. I remember when it was. It was when I was working on the student newspaper at Yale. It was actually not when I was National Security Advisor. I remember sleeping for 21 and a half hours straight.
Sleeping?
Sleeping.
Oh my God.
After going, I think, like 50 hours without sleeping.
That's wild.
Which one? More coffee or more sleep?
Can I have both? What's your favorite age?
President Biden had this thing about Satchel Paige.
When I read this question, I thought the same thing. Go ahead.
Where Satchel Paige was a baseball pitcher who played in the Negro Leagues, didn't get a chance to play in Major League Baseball till he was pretty old. So he was in his
40s or something.
He was in his 40s. By the way, this is a story President Biden told. I've never looked it up, but
a story he told, by the way, I don't think we're giving away too much, to Xi Jinping.
He did tell it to Xi Jinping, yeah. And so Satchel Paige is in his 40s. He pitches a win, and they come up to him and they say, Satch, how does it feel to be pitching a win in the major leagues when you're so old? And he says, boys, that's not how I look at age. I said, how do you look at age? He says, how old would you be if you didn't know how old you were? I think that's a great question.
What's your answer to that question? Not from our list?
Probably 33.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe mid-30s. Fortunately, that's a while ago.
What was your childhood dream job as a kid?
Sportscaster. Who is your historical hero?
Truman. Maggie has a photo of Lincoln on her phone, not a photo of me. I have a photo of Maggie.
Can't take that too personally.
But I didn't put Truman on my phone. So. Who is your favorite character in a book, movie, or TV show?
I would say most interesting, most complicated character is from this French spy show, The Bureau. The sort of main French spy whose name is eluding me, but that's
Malotru?
Yeah,
isn't it
exactly.
Malotru?
I think that might be his
nom de guerre.
Yeah, exactly. Not his actual name, but that's an awesome show, by the way.
That is an awesome show
for the recommendations category. What's your go-to karaoke song?
Oh, I have two: The Gambler and Friends in Low Places.
I was going to guess Friends in Low Places for you.
What's your secret talent?
Secret talent. Oh, this is a very weird secret talent. I'm very good at pretending that I am making a phone call and carrying on a totally fictitious conversation without actually being on the phone.
That is disturbing.
Disturbing talent. What's the one skill you wish you learned 10 years ago?
Coding, even though it's going out of style.
Going the way of the dodo.
No, but because understanding coding allows you to more deeply understand AI. I don't want to be a coder for life, but I'd like to understand it.
Okay.
What's the one skill you're determined to learn in the next 5 to 10 years?
I will confess or acknowledge I just bought a guitar, which feels almost like a midlife crisis move, but I'd like to learn how to play guitar. When you're stuck making an important decision, what's the first thing you reach for? Phone, notebook, coffee, something else?
Probably the phone.
That's what I was going to guess for you.
When you're stuck making an important decision, who's the first person you call?
Well, for quite some time, it was you, I will admit. These days, because the decisions are, I would say, less policy high-minded, my family, my dad, my sister, others in my family. Are you more likely to cut a meeting or add a meeting?
Add a meeting, for sure.
Yeah. If you said the opposite, I would have called BS on that.
Are you most likely to cut a sentence from a memo or add one?
I would love to be the kind of person who would say cut, but unfortunately, I am the kind of person who adds.
Thank you for being honest.
Yeah. Who would be your dream dinner party guest or guests, dead or alive?
Here, I'd probably say Lincoln. Actually, that's a homage to Maggie.
Maggie would want to be the plus
she'd
one.
want to be there.
Quite clearly.
Yeah. What would be your dream overseas flight seatmate, dead or alive? That's complicated because you don't know how much you want to talk or just sleep or watch a movie.
I'm going to go with Ernest Hemingway.
Wow. Okay.
Last one. What's your New Year's resolution?
I don't have one yet. You got to come up with one.
You got time.
Yeah. What's a New Year's resolution you always make but never keep?
Get more sleep, be a better person. I won't say which one I never keep.
I think we reached the end of the list and did a C+ job.
I'd give us B+. Well, that's all for today. We'll be back next week with a new episode.
In the meantime, send us your questions and comments at longgame@voxmedia.com.